Hi guys, thank you for having me here. As Alan said, I look over the design and tech categories at Kickstarter with a wonderful team of people that have come through here at various times as well. And we have kind of a broad mandate to keep the categories interesting, help out our creators in any way that we can. And we've been doing that for about 3 years. So this talk is kind of fresh. I threw away any sort of this is what Kickstarter is and how it works, and focused more on trying to seek out some ways that we can look at the design categories from an interesting angle that would help students. So this is why we were made. The founders created Kickstarter about 6 years ago with the very simple premise of let's acknowledge the fact that everybody is capable of creating amazing things, and if everybody applies their minds towards it, they can use the internet as a resource to do that. This is me. I've backed 845 projects. Oftentimes I back projects for $1 just to kind of follow along and see what's going on. And we have 15 creative categories. So we are thinking and talking about design and product design more specifically, but we have categories like theater and journalism and film, and kind of this whole thing together of a creative culture is really what makes our platform so powerful and interesting. Through our lifetime, we've had about 90,000 projects successfully funded. And that was created by $2 billion pledged on the site from 9 million total backers. And more interestingly, 30% of those backers come back and have pledged to more than one project on our site. Of the projects that we've had funded, 65 have raised over $1 million, 400 projects have raised over $250,000, and 1,600 projects have raised between $50,000 and $250,000. That last number is specifically, the last two numbers are specifically about design and technology projects, and that last one is probably the more interesting one. Because when you're talking about the very high end of $1 million plus projects, you're talking about large, sophisticated teams that have been working on products for a long time, have a sense of where and how to deliver on them. The smaller ones, those are more interesting. There's a lot that you can do with $50,000 in terms of, let's say, tooling, and we're going to dive into that for a bit. I did a talk recently internally and spoke a little bit about product design, and this is stuff that you guys know, but it's interesting to look at it from the perspective of somebody who doesn't really engage in product design or manufacturing. So I started talking a little bit about how you can fundamentally break things down into 4 different parts, right? The design process of what is it that we're making, starting with a sketch or a conversation and ending with something that is more in the ideation scope of a prototype. And getting yourself through like a design for manufacturing, getting all the way to design for manufacturing, which you figure out with probably more than one person of how does this thing actually get made. And then of course, working with different kinds of manufacturers or different kinds of suppliers to actually get something made and then shipping it. Now, before Kickstarter, before there was kind of product design as a thing and a category in Kickstarter, this was still more or less the process, except that by the time the public knew about it, you were somewhere between here and here, mostly towards here. That's how things were and still are for the majority of things in our lives up until 6 years ago. What Kickstarter fundamentally does is it shifts the conversation and the visibility of what people are working on as product designers to somewhere in between here and here. And if you're thinking more along the lines of the design process, you're now at a place where you're introducing a very complex, messy, iterative process to the public. And the public at large doesn't know necessarily about design thinking, about iteration. All they generally know about is, I have a thing in my life, I bought it at a store. Now you're approaching them and saying to them online and on the internet and through Kickstarter, this is how this thing is getting made. Here's where I am with this. Here are all the things that I still have left to do. And there's a moment in which you decide to go public with your project as something that the public will engage with and possibly back as a project on Kickstarter. And there are 4 fundamental factors that you can kind of push and pull on before you go public with your project. And Those are fundamentally money, time, experience, and what I call banality, which is really just reducing or increasing features or innovation. So if you think of the product development cycle and you focus on post-ideation, post that first proof of concept, you think of your looks-like prototype and your works-like prototype. Those are kind of the two phases that you can work in parallel and iterate on. And you think about the very beginning. There's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of risk, because you know less about how this is fundamentally going to get made. And also, if you show it to a public audience, the experience and the interactions might be less refined, and it might be a lot harder to describe. But you spent less money, you spent less time on it. So at that point, if you go public with it on Kickstarter, you're showing something that's a little bit, might be a little bit cranky, might be a little bit unsophisticated in terms of its user experience. So what are you going to rely on to be able to really showcase that product? And there's some opportunities in there for somebody who can think about things very creatively. So before we get to this, just kind of looking at this again for a second to just emphasize that if you're launching a project on Kickstarter early on, right, there's less that you have to show. If you spend more time on it, you spend more money on it, the more you iterate on it, the further along you get, you have a lot more to show. It's a more refined product. It looks a lot more like the thing that you want to send to people. You're getting closer to design for manufacturing and to manufacturing. But at that level, you have absorbed a lot of that risk yourself because you've spent money and you've spent time. So there's a balance there, right? There's kind of a fulcrum of when do I go to Kickstarter. And the last two things are basically mitigating factors, meaning that if you've done this before, or if somebody on your team has done this before, you can take some risks, you can take some chances. You can say, yes, we know that we'll be able to replace, that we'll be able to tool up based on our 3D print, even though it's not exactly the thing that we're going to need later on. We've done this before. So experience is a mitigating factor. And banality is just the notion of, for me, we're going to drop some features. We're going to make this a little bit bigger. It's not going to be as svelte. It's not going to have interesting materials that we originally thought we would be able to do. And so for the creative mind that is approaching Kickstarter with a product, there are some opportunities that you can take advantage of in terms of balancing that stuff out for the public. I think of them as creative narrative and storytelling. Who are you? What is it that you're making? And really developing that story and inspiring people to back you at an earlier stage for your project. Product transparency and backer participation. Product transparency in the sense of how is this being made? Who's making it? What components are going into this? You know, some of the more traditional frameworks around this is, for example, open source or Creative Commons. Experimentation and community. Really, if you're developing something that's really early, finding the right kind of community to do that with. Something that might present at Maker Faire is probably going to be a little more DIY, might have exposed circuitry, because that community is ready to absorb that and really take it on as a product. Whereas you can't take that and showcase it at Best Buy, for example. Although that might be changing. And then, of course, scales of production and commitment to production, of the difference between I'm making one thing versus I'm making 10,000 things, and the consequences that come from that. So let's look at these one by one with some examples. So the creator narrative of finding the story that you want to tell. There's a few different ways to look at this. There's the story of your product, there's a story of yourself, and there's a story of how you're going to make it. These of course combine and interject with each other, but they're also just three different lenses that you can look at the world through. This is Debbie from Goldilocks, and she basically made a toy for young women to inspire them to engage in engineering. And if you look at her project, it's fundamentally like her story. It's, I'm an engineer who went to Stanford. I had a boring job in engineering. I didn't want to do it anymore. I started doing this. And to back her project is to back Debbie. And at that point, when you're backing Debbie, the state of product development doesn't matter as much as you saying, I like her story, I like what she's doing, I like what she stands for, I'm behind this. And remember, backing a project on Kickstarter also means that like there's going to be a time that elapses between I backed this project and helped fund it to when I will have this in my hands. So think about what it takes to sustain that kind of engagement. And sometimes it's very like personality and story driven. And we've had a lot of cases like this. I went to, nobody thinks of Pebble as this, but Pebble is also this. Pebble is the smartwatch that raised, oh, everybody knows it, great. We did a party with Pebble at South by Southwest, and I knew who I was going to invite. I wanted to invite people who have run projects. I said, who are you going to invite? And they said, oh, we're going to invite our backers. I thought they were going to say journalists or something like that. No, no, no. They invited original backers of their project. So I'm in a room with about 500 people that backed the original Pebble project, and all they want to do is they want to talk to Eric. They want to talk to the engineers who made this product. And think about that for a second. There's only one company that like the public has that kind of emotional relationship with, and it's Apple. And there's only one Apple, but there's all of us. And if you can find 100 or 200 or 500 people that you can develop that kind of direct relationship with, you're engaging with them on a whole other level. And a lot of that is really just fundamentally storytelling. But storytelling is also describing the user experience of what you're doing. If you are making something fundamentally new and somebody doesn't have a cognitive framework for what you're doing, you're going to have to explain that in the project, in the Kickstarter project page and video. And that's a matter of like really going through the process of showcasing a user experience that might be really early on in its development, and finding ways to explain, not just, and I'm not just talking in terms of like personas, which is kind of like a great way to start thinking about it, but really thinking in terms of, this is something new, people have never seen this before. How do I describe it? How do I show it? How do I make it meaningful so that it fits their lives, so they can start to like experience it like emotionally of what it would be like for them to live with this thing. One of the things that I kind of push people towards is reminding them that they need to have human beings present with their product. Another thing is just like using what I call kind of like in-between moments. Like if you're making a new kind of electronics experience, you're still going to need to charge it. You're still going to need like indicator LEDs. And those are kind of like really good cognitive hooks because people have seen those things before. They use products like that already. So those are kind of like interesting user experience hooks. The other part of it is that the Kickstarter page itself can be and should be a design object. There's kind of like a meta-narrative here of Kickstarter has been around for 6 years. People go to the site, they see projects, and they've probably seen, especially like I said earlier, 30% of our backers have backed a project before. You want yours to stand out, and you want to treat it as a design object unto itself. This is a project called Makeshift Society, and I usually like to show it because they did something that people sometimes neglect, which is to just remember that like it's a vertical flow, and to kind of like frame it using white space, and they treated it as a design object, as a design exercise. So on the issue of product transparency and how to build trust with backers, all of these things relate to each other, so there's some storytelling in here too. Nobody knows who you are. You're on the internet, you launch a project on Kickstarter, now you have to explain to the world who you are. And one of the ways that you can do that is just being as transparent as possible. So you talk about things like, you showcase your prototypes and you show people what you did and how you got to where you are. If there is anybody in this world that can do this, it's the people in this room. And it's a huge strength to be able to tell the world, I started with an idea that was a sketch, I 3D printed something, and here's how I went from here to here. And showing people that full development cycle makes them a little more confident and a little more understanding of what you're going through and how you're going to get to the next step. Another way to think about it is using open source, like an open source attitude. So this is a team that's partially based out of New York called Public Laboratories, and they run a few projects with us, and they tend to focus on citizen science. Now, when you're doing something like a DIY spectrometry kit, There's some very fundamental trust that needs to be built between somebody who's backing the project and the team that's making it, because this is about like measuring like understanding your environment in a deeper way. So everything that they do is open source, which allows at least some portion of the public to validate the project for everyone else. And this is a little bit where storytelling comes into it. If you treat your project just as like an engineering or product design exercise, then the only people who will really understand it are people like us, right? People like you guys. But there's a balance that you have to strike there. And the example that I'd like to kind of like throw to is Pixar movies. In the sense that Pixar movies have this like wonderful split in which they speak to the majority of their audience is children, but they also have to make it appeal to adults. And so you see that humor like riding through those movies in a way that it speaks to both audiences. Some of that works here too, in the sense that the majority of your project and your storytelling and your presentation is going to be focused on the user experience of what you're doing, on what the product looks like, feels like, and how it works. But there's a sliver that has to ride through the entire thing that should be that can and should be focused on developing trust with your peers. And the way to always think about this, just as kind of like a rule of thumb, is if I'm backing our project at Kickstarter, what do I need to see as a product developer and as a designer? What are the elements that I like to see, that I like to hear about, the questions that I want to ask? From an engineering point of view, it's usually things like, what's in your bill of materials? Do you have continuity with your suppliers? What's your manufacturing plan? Have you done something like this before? What is your experience doing something like this before? These are just fundamental questions that they sound a little bit boring, but if you can engage with that, if you can engage with those questions in a confident manner from the very beginning of a campaign, they become part of your core story. And they also act as a way to allow a critical part of your audience to validate and create trust around what you're doing. Experimentation. Sometimes people think of Kickstarter as this like one big cliff that they have to get to and jump over. It doesn't have to be. Oftentimes, you can run a project for an early beta of what you're doing. And this affects kind of like the scale of what you're doing as well. So this is called Fishbit. They were part of an accelerator in San Francisco called Highway 1, and we had a bunch of conversations. Fishbit is a kind of better way to track the health of your aquarium, and they ran a project with us last year for their beta units. Much more expensive, much more DIY. I think they did it for about 100 units, maybe 50. For them, it was a matter of getting some developer units out into the world and seeing how people use it so that it can inform their design process. I want more people to do this. And it's a move away towards thinking about Kickstarter as this one big cliff that I have to get to, and more about thinking of Kickstarter as as part of the iterative process of saying I can run a Kickstarter campaign for 10 units, and then 6 months later, I can run it for 100 units based on what I learned from the first one, and then 1,000 units. Now, this doesn't work for everything and for everybody, but it's a way to kind of mitigate some of those risks that we were talking about earlier, of what is it like of spending more time and money, of just being able to experiment with Kickstarter in a way that informs the product development cycle itself. Now, again, as I said before, it doesn't necessarily work for everything and for everybody, but I truly think that this is kind of the next wave of how people will start using Kickstarter for products. This is a kind of like an earlier project by Josh Harkin for a 3D printed skull object that he did with Shapeways. This is also like a different version of experimentation, which is to say, what can I do within the existing ecosystem that I can actually just iterate on very quickly digitally and then ship to people as fast as possible? And using Shapeways is one of them. And he's kind of done like 3 or 4 different projects. These aren't huge volume projects, but it allows him to kind of like be very rapid about his experimentation. And along the same vein of 3D printing, if you start to think of experimentation and iterative cycles, you can start to say, okay, what else is out there that I can plug into what I'm working with? You guys are probably familiar with Arduino. Beyond that, you can start to think about things like the Particle platform, which does, which is based on Arduino stuff, and you're able to do like IoT products in a very rapid fashion because they have their own cloud infrastructure. 3D printing, IoT, and electronics, like all these platforms, if you kind of kludge them all together into a product, again, it's more of like a proof of concept and early iterations of a product, but there are probably 10 people in the world that would love to have this. And why not? What is it like to ship 10 of something as a product? It's a different kind of product, but it's a matter of finding the right community that it'll resonate with. And of course, scales, understanding what your commitments are. 1 of something, 10 of something, 100 of something, 10,000 of something. So I use this slide a lot, and just as a way to kind of get people into that modality of 10 of something, you can make it by hand, 100 of something, it can be a little bit more DIY, not necessarily handmade. You might want to get some sub-assemblies from somewhere else. 1,000 of something, you never want to DIY. This is one of those things with Kickstarter that we see sometimes in which somebody doesn't necessarily think through what the time commitments might be for themselves with this, and they end up spending every single evening for 6 months hand building something. And when we think about scales, it's not necessarily just about like my time and my money in terms of production commitments. It's also a matter of if you're in the 10,000 or 1,000 and you have suppliers, talking to them and making sure that they will be able to handle whatever it is that you're working on as you scale up. And there's also something else. When you're dealing with Kickstarter, you're also dealing with human beings. This is your community, right? Forget the word crowdfunding. These are real people. And they want to be able to talk to you, and they will talk to you. And you want to be able to engage with them in a really like sincere, direct, and human way. And there's a difference between talking to one person, 10 people, 1,000 people, and 10,000 people. It's a different scale of communication. At 10,000, you're trying to figure out a way to say, okay, I have one message that I need to tell everybody. How do I do that? And now you're engaging in community support, and that's a whole other thing. You want to make sure that that's a commitment that you're going to be able to make. Some examples of people that have done this in different and interesting ways on their own terms. This is a team called Fire and Bone. They've run 3 campaigns with us so far. They're a team that came out of MakerBot, and they use 3D scanning and 3D printing to get to the point where they can cast animal skulls. They've used Kickstarter for themselves. They're a team of 3 people. They have a product lineup, and every time that they want to release new products, they release them on Kickstarter. They still do their own fulfillment. They still do their own packaging, their own shipping. And I'm good friends with them, so we talk about this stuff sometimes. And this is a conscious decision that they're making. But it fundamentally limits the scale that they can grow to. But they don't want to hire people. They prefer staying small, and they prefer doing things by hand. It allows them to have a little bit more of the margin. And it's a decision, right? You can say, I can do this myself, and we won't grow as fast, but they don't need to. And they take advantage of Kickstarter as a platform, and every 6 months, they launch a new campaign with a new product lineup. And every time they do that, they raise enough money to scale production with their suppliers. Something else to consider with something like this is the fact that if they wanted to, let's say, double or triple their production, their current suppliers wouldn't be able to do it. They would have to find other suppliers to work with. And in doing so, they would have to introduce new elements of their process like quality assurance, because once you have something that's coming from 3 different factories, you have to make sure that like everything is consistent across the different suppliers. This is a great project. This is called Neo Lucida, and it was developed by 2 professors out of Chicago, one out of Carnegie Mellon, Pablo Garcia and Golan Levin. And they started it as I should describe what it is. It's a prism that you look through, and you're able to draw while actually also looking at the thing or person in front of you. It's based on an old device that people used to use for drawing and was very popular hundreds of years ago. And they decided to redo it as a product. Their initial thought was, we're going to do this once, we'll ship a few hundred of these, and then we'll be done. So they launched the project, and they sold out of their rewards in a few hours. So now they were locked into a 30-day campaign with backers, with people coming to the project and saying, there's nothing for me to back here. So they had to shift their strategy mid-campaign. And we had a lot of conversations about this. And these are two people who fundamentally didn't want to quit their jobs and just start making Neo Lucidas for the rest of their lives. So they did two things which I thought were very smart. The first thing that they did was they decided, okay, we're no longer going to hand make these. We are going to find somebody to help us manufacture these in larger numbers. And that's kind of where the Kickstarter ecosystem came into play. And a different creator that had gone through this process already and had relationships with the right kind of facilities abroad was able to work directly with them. And they also open sourced it. They also said, whoever else wants to make this can make this. You can't call it Neo Lucida, but you can make something that is exactly this because we're publishing this. So that allowed them to kind of alleviate, in the long term, some of the pressure from people that said, we want this right now. They said, okay, well, you can't have it right now, but eventually anybody will be able to make this. So you'll see tons of other people making this because we've proven that there's an opportunity and a market for something like this. But they also allowed for themselves to continue making it with a partner under the name Neo Lucida. And in this, you can kind of see the glimmer of how two people who don't want necessarily to spin up a huge company to do this with, or don't have the time and the ability to travel a lot to maintain supplier relationships, can develop at least one product and potentially a product lineup from this. You give things up. You give up control, you give up big parts of the market for something like this, but you can keep core what you think is the most important aspect of this, which in this case was the education around what they're doing, the name of what they had created, and just the continuity of knowing that this product will be out in the world for people to use. This is Makey Makey. It's a little electronics board by Jay Silver. He was at the MIT Media Lab, and what this does, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is it turns anything into a keyboard. It does capacitive sensing, capacitive touch sensing. Little side note, this has the most lo-fi product video you've ever seen. But it doesn't matter because it has it just resonates immediately once you watch it. It's just children playing with the Makey Makey and adults and just having a lot of fun with it. So it's like keyboards made of fruit, aluminum foil on steps, and people run up and down and make music with it. So that's just kind of the side note of if you ever hear somebody say, you must spend a lot of money to make a video. Not necessarily. You can and should do whatever you can and want. Now, Jay ran a successful campaign for, I think, about $600,000 with the Makey Makey, and has spun this into a little product that finances all the other creative and wonderful things that he wants to do with his life. And he also did not have to spin up a huge organization or a huge company. He worked with a lot of different kinds of partners to make sure that this is manufacturable for the right community. So there isn't necessarily like a beautiful enclosure for it. It ships in a very simple box, and he does everything through either direct sales on his website or platforms like Amazon. And it still maintains like a large community that engages with each other on his website. So that's the other aspect of this, which is that if you want to have something like this succeed, there has to be continuity online where people can tell each other stories about how they're using this and what they're doing with it. And this is a project called, I think, Lumio. Max, the product designer who made this, very inspiring story. I don't think he's a trained designer, but he prototyped this out, and after the project exceeded his expectations on Kickstarter, he decided he was going to quit his job and figure out the supply chain himself. So of course, this is not easy, but it is definitely possible. If you wanted to spend your time developing a product and figuring out the manufacturing yourself, the opportunities are there. if you wanted to take a trip to Shenzhen, what you would find is that there's a very high concentration of suppliers that are willing to talk to you. And if you want to spend that time and traveling to actually like build your own supply chain, it's not something that anybody should be afraid of. I was in Shenzhen a few weeks ago, and I was astonished at kind of like the velocity of conversations. I immediately signed up for a local chat platform that's very popular called WeChat, and I was having conversations with like 4 or 5 different people that I knew, who then introduced me to other people on WeChat, and you can go from I know nobody to knowing hundreds of people that have gone through this process before you within a week. So all I'm saying with this is don't be afraid to actually engage with the process of manufacturing if that's something that interests you. And Arduboy is kind of like a tiny little Arduino-based Game Boy. Same sort of thing. Kevin Bates went to Shenzhen, and this is a good example because he was a part of an accelerator called HAX. And there's more and more of these places around the world. This one in particular is in Shenzhen, and if you wanted kind of like that midway point of, well, I kind of want to go to Shenzhen, there's things like this happening now, right? There's different parts of the ecosystem that are kind of like rising up and filling in these gaps, and it's a matter of choosing the one that most appeals to you. So for Kevin, it meant that he could go to Shenzhen and spend time in a facility that had all the right connections already, had a lot of prototyping facilities, and he could iterate very quickly on the work that he wanted to do. That's kind of all I have, actually. Questions? Who has run a project so far? Who's run a project so far? Which one?
It's called an Original Pin. It's a flat pack laser cut pinhole camera.
Oh, cool. That's right. I think I've seen this. Yeah.
Yeah, it was an interesting experience. I think that what you were explaining about sort of the volume and like the different approaches that you need to take with the volume, I think that there was a lot of good insight there in terms of like when at a point, when do you DIY it, when do you sort of like take it to the next level. And so I think that, overall it was a really good experience. I think like that 6 months, when you said like getting home from work every night and spending every weekend doing that for like 6 months, yeah, that was like a very true experience for me, and until I kind of brought people on board. And so it was a really tough thing to do. I mean, I'm not going to say like it was like all up through the moment when it ended was awesome, and then after that it became very not awesome. But reflecting on it, I think I learned more in that sort of 6 months than I, about product design and like engaging with the community and all of that kind of stuff, than I could have ever really gotten from a traditional undergraduate education.
That's cool.
With that. So
yeah, there's kind of like I kind of want to see what you think about this. There's like a bit of like a Trojan horse aspect to a Kickstarter campaign for engineers and designers. By the time you're through with it, you know how to do support. You know how to talk to a broad audience, you know how to do product photography, you know how to do marketing. It's kind of amazing. It's a bit of a forcing function. To some extent, doing things by hand and kind of coming home and doing everything for like a few months, as arduous as it can be, there is a great satisfaction that comes from it, and also just like the knowledge of how to do it the next time in a better way.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it definitely hasn't scared me away from doing it again, but I would agree with you on that. I mean, the amount of hats that I had to wear to do that was incredible, and I mean, I feel much more well-rounded, I guess, is a kind of generic way to say it after the experience. But yeah, I think it was definitely incredible, and I would recommend anybody doing it.
Did you do it alone or with a collaborator?
Alone.
So that's another part of it, right? Like
Yeah.
sometimes like the way to get through this is to not do it alone.
Yeah.
And make sure that like you're sharing the burden with somebody else.
Yeah, it was a very solo project when I had done it, and I think that, you know, definitely that was another learning experience. Once I found a manufacturer, because I'd been doing it through a maker space and kind of thought that I could DIY the whole thing, and once that, it became really apparent that that wasn't the case, and I found somebody to sort of work with. He's now my business partner on the thing, and I mean, things have gone incredibly smooth, a lot smoother after you start to bring together that team.
Right.
So,
I mean, it's a big glib of me to say like, oh, just, you know, more planning, but fundamentally, that's really what it is.
Yeah.
It's a lot of spreadsheets, and it's a lot of like going out into the world and saying, I can make 10 of these, who can make 1,000 of these? And before you run the campaign, just talking in scenarios and in theory and saying, if I was to come to you 6 months from now and say, I need you to make 1,000 of these, could you do it? Yes. How much would it cost? This much. What would the lead time be? Just having a lot of these theoretical conversations. And I mean, it's not gonna work out like, it's not going to be exactly like that, but it will help you sleep better if during the campaign you realize, oh, my manufacturing strategy just shifted based on what happened in this campaign. Yes, and then over here.
Is this on? I don't think so.
I think that's just for the video.
Oh, I got it. I was wondering to what extent the Kickstarter team is involved with individual campaigns, because it seemed to me before your presentation that Kickstarter was like a platform and you used it and you did what you could, but like from what I got from what you were just saying to us, it seems like there's more involvement and
there is
more support.
You know, it's tricky. I started Kickstarter in January of 2013, so almost 3 years. We were, I think, 45 people total. I was the first person there to kind of like think exclusively and work exclusively with the design and tech communities. That team is now 5 people. And our mandate is wide enough, and we have enough freedom to not have to think of anything other than make sure we have interesting, great things and help the community do that. So we don't get to talk to everybody, but we do get to have conversations like this. And we do get to say, if you're thinking about a project, like, you know, swing by for lunch at the office and like, let's talk about it a little more in depth. And sometimes we do like engage like in a longer term way with projects, like if we feel that there's something fundamental there that we want to shine a light on. A lot of this for us is finding ways to make sure that there are great projects that will act as kind of like beacons of best practices for the rest of the world that might not have a chance to talk to us. And then it's our job to make sure that like we are finding a path to those other people out in the world.
Yeah, so I've been a member of the Kickstarter platform for a couple years now, and it's gone through a lot of changes. There was the famous rendering ban. And I've recently started getting a lot of emails going, rate your experience. Did you get the stuff that you signed up for? And so that's made me a little curious. I'm not sure if this is really your wheelhouse, but what's going on behind the scenes that's making it easier to follow through on what you've promised?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think if you kind of think about like what I talked about here today, you'll see that there's a lot of thought that like myself and my team is going through in terms of thinking about when is the right time to do a project, right? I think that's one of the big fundamentals here of what's the right time to come to the world and say, I think I've spent enough time and money to know how this is going to happen. And I can share it in a way that like will really relay the experience to you of like what you will receive when this is done. So we're thinking a lot about this. It's definitely something that everybody at the company cares about in a deep way. We just released a fulfillment report that we did in collaboration with the university, with a professor at University of Pennsylvania. And what came out was that 9% of projects actually fail to deliver. And we want to know what's going on, and we want to be able to kind of have the right conversations to start fixing some of these things. You know, it's an ongoing conversation. Ultimately, the relationship between a backer and a creator is its own thing, And that's kind of what drives us. But we want to be involved. We want to know about what's going on so that we can help.
Good point.
Hi. This is probably easier said than done, but building off what Michael had said and what you were saying about scaling up, with the Kickstarter brand name, has there been any thought to like build relationships with manufacturers and then offer that as like a service or a tutorial service for creators who may not have that experience to scale up their production, to offer advice or basic guidance?
To some extent, the ecosystem just takes care of this on its own. I have a pretty close relationship with a company called Dragon Innovation because they've worked on so many different Kickstarter campaigns. So they did the initial, they're a contract manufacturing consultant, and they did all the initial work on Pebble. They're working closely with the Coolest Cooler. And, there's been a rise of, if there is a need for something, the ecosystem will rise up and provide it because there's an opportunity there. So there's companies like Dragon, there's Hacks, the accelerator in Shenzhen that I was talking about earlier in terms of like the product development. There's Seed Studio, which does a lot of like electronics boards in the maker community. And there's, to some extent, we don't need to do it very directly, but where an introduction is appropriate, like part of what my team does is to also think about like, okay, how do we help in this too? How do we make the right kind of introduction for someone? If someone says, oh, I need somebody who knows zippers, well, we'll try to find somebody who knows zippers if that's within our domain. It's a very giving community. This is like one of the things that like is very near and dear to our team, which is to know that at any given moment, we can call up one of like hundreds and hundreds of any of these creators that have run a campaign and say, hey, I have somebody who needs advice on a pinhole camera, or maybe not as competitive, but like if we understand what everybody's doing and how they're doing it, then we can facilitate a lot of these introductions. And we also have a Q&A forum because we can't always kind of do this on an ad hoc basis.
I have a couple questions. The first is, I think more than half of the people in the room are finishing Arduino projects today, tomorrow.
Congrats.
That might be very interesting for them, a couple of them, to maybe think about, like, what would I do? What do you see if I ship 10 of these or 25 of these or 50 of these? Maybe you could think about it a little bit and then pitch a little something. And then the other question is, I was wondering if you could comment on the sort of extraordinary Beyond B Corp pledge that Kickstarter has made as a kind of corporate citizen, which I think is important for the students to know about. And I don't know if you read Yancey's essay or not, actually.
Yeah, so the first one, if anybody wants to talk to me about their project, by all means, like it's one of the things that I'm here to do. And on the second one, we recently reincorporated. So there's two things out there. There's a B Corp, which is more of like a pledge of saying that we're going to be a socially responsible company. We were that, but we went one step further and we've reincorporated as a public benefit corporation, which ostensibly or roughly is somewhere between a purely for-profit company and a not-profit. We are still a for-profit company. However, our official charter also includes some other very direct commitments to the world. I was just talking to one of our founders today about this, Perry, who was CEO before Yancey, and we were talking about the PBC, and he said they worked on that document for 6 months. It was a very like personal process that they went through, and a lot of this has to do with like, do we do things just for money or do we do things for other reasons? Okay, of course we do things for other reasons. Let's make those official and let's make public commitments around these things. And if you look at our charter, we have very clear commitments around supporting the arts, about creating a sustainable organization for the environment. And one of the things that we talked about today was, okay, so how do we work with creators in the design and tech categories to, like, how do we support them in being more green? Because that's part of our charter. And everybody who joins the company joins knowing that, like, we are a company that has publicly committed towards being a more responsible company and not just being profit seeking. It's It's not a nonprofit though. So this is, and that's kind of the interesting part. It's a way of saying that like there is a third way, there is a path in the middle, and everybody in the company is extremely like proud and supportive of this endeavor. It gives everybody like a different sense of purpose and meaning.
But they're also, just to finish, you've taken away this eventuality of going public. No one believes that you will go
Oh, yeah.
public. In fact, you've said we will never go public.
Yes.
That I think is quite fascinating, especially in light of Etsy going public.
That's right. And Etsy is a B Corp. They did go public. Yancey and Perry have publicly said many times over that, you know, we have no plans of going public. From my perspective, I can tell you how it influences my day-to-day, which is simply that by not being driven for financial growth, my mandate, our team's mandate of saying like, let's keep these categories healthy and interesting means that if somebody in this room has a very interesting project that will only ship 10 units, I have no pressure from anybody. None of my bosses are like, no, it has to like be like pretty big, like, cause that's important. We already have that. We get that. Like, we're a profitable company. We have growth, but that is not the only thing that we are meant to do. And here's like the best part about this. In pursuing like a more creative endeavor and a more creative strategy around like what our communities do, it also means that fundamentally we're going to have better projects. And that of course leads to growth. So it's such an interesting thing to say that if you don't focus on the money, in the long run you'll make more of it because you're focusing on the right thing.
Thank you so much for sharing all these great information with us. So you talked about the role of Kickstarter in shifting the visibility of the project, and some projects got featured like on the website, and I'm curious to know who decides on this. They get more visibility, of course. And
We're giving you John's cell number.
Yeah.
actually, Lucy was talking about how the projects who get funded 60%, they get pushed to the featured projects, and then they are kind of get more help to get funded to 100%. But obviously you can't do it for all the projects. So how do you, is it connection based, or is there an algorithm, or is it, how involved is the human factor and like personal taste of Kickstarter employees? And
you know, we have a dedicated curation team, and their job is to look at as many projects as possible and try to find ways to elevate them and promote them. Of course, our team has a hand in that, and sometimes some of the conversations that we have with smaller teams is helping them frame their project in a way that we know will help them succeed on Kickstarter. And ultimately, that also means that it's something that our curation team will notice as well. There's definitely a thing in which sometimes the public thinks like, oh, you gotta know somebody. What you have to do is make a project that has good photography, that there's no spelling mistakes, that it like puts like the user experience like front and center, that it's a good product that you've gotten feedback from other people on, right? And if it stands alone as a great idea and a great project that you're proud of, believe me, we're probably gonna staff pick it. If there's anything that like, it's glib to say like, oh, just make sure it's a good project. What's more important is to say like, make sure you've put a lot of work in it, because that's the thing that we look for. We look for someone that says like, oh, somebody spent a lot of time like making sure this represented them in like a meaningful way. Let's make sure that it gets like the attention that it deserves. And we do that for a lot of projects. We don't do it for all of them, and we do it for, and it ultimately ends up being a small percentage of the projects on the site. But it's less about like who do you know, and more about like, let's make sure that like this really represents me. One tiny little rubric, one tiny little trick is make sure that you're presenting your project in a way that you will be proud of 5 years from now. It's a weird little thing, like I call it the acid jeans rule. Like make sure you're not wearing acid jeans in the video so that you don't go like, oh God, Does that help? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I was curious, assuming that successful projects have a great idea or at least an engaging idea at their core. I was wondering if there's any like advantage or disadvantage or difference between projects that require some level of expertise for production or level of manufacturing versus something where you would say, oh, that's a great idea, I could just make that myself, or if there's any sort of experience you have with that.
So I want to make sure that I understand the question. If there's any advantage in doing less complex projects?
Well, I was actually thinking advantage in doing more complex projects, like in terms of, like people want to back it because they couldn't do it themselves, and so you're providing something that they wouldn't be able to do otherwise, versus like something that is potentially could be totally DIY focused and it's like an Instructable, and you say, hey, I have this great idea, you all can make it. I just wonder if there's like if that kind of thing still sells and gets backed on Kickstarter.
I think there's two different vectors here. One is like the finding your community and making sure they know who you are and what you're doing because they're gonna like it. So in that sense, something that's like a little more DIY and they have to make themselves. Sometimes a lot of that value is the design work that you've put into it and providing them with like all the right parts that they can get themselves combined with the specific things that you've done to allow them to make it. And that's kind of like on the more DIY sensibility, like anything that will be assembled by the user, right? But there's another kind of like another lens to look through this, and that's kind of, it's on the fulcrum of what is innovation. In that sense, projects that get a lot of attention on our site are things that don't exist. A Bluetooth speaker is something that you can walk into any electronics store and buy one of like 50 different kinds. So another Bluetooth speaker on Kickstarter is probably not as interesting as the one Bluetooth speaker that when you pick it up and shake it, plays a song that depends on what kind of like motion you gave it. That's something that's different, that's interesting. And there's an element there of like, oh, as weird as that is, it's not something that I can go get in a store. So there's complexity to that, and I think I am describing a real project. There's complexity to that you just can't replicate as easily. And there's also a risk in that, right? That there's just not enough people that find that interesting. Does that answer the question?
Kind of, yeah. I have
Okay.
a very specific thing in mind, so.
Okay.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us
you.
today. I have a question about social capital. When you spoke about how brands or companies will, when they launch a new product, they'll launch it on Kickstarter as opposed to maybe launching it on their own platform or their own shop. I thought that was really fascinating because for me, like I look at it and I would be a little bit concerned about spending my social capital a lot. Like, you know, if I'm constantly putting stuff out on Kickstarter, are people going to get tired of seeing my stuff on Kickstarter? How do you make the most of that relationship and keep people interested in what you're putting out?
By being honest. But I mean, okay, so that's a little superficial as an answer. But you're probably a fan of music or movies. Every time that a band puts out new music, nobody goes like, "Ugh, I can't believe they have the gall to put out new music." People are like, they're excited about it. So the same rules apply here. And with music, the version of that doesn't work in which a band might lose social capital is when they sell out. So don't sell out. Make a thing that's worthwhile. Tell people what it is that you've made and why you've made it, and give them different kinds of opportunities to engage with what you're doing. So your first project, you'll probably email all your friends, you'll probably email your family, and people feel weird about that, and that's a good feeling to have. But if you're able to give them different ways to support you, and ultimately just frame it as a way of saying, I've done a thing, I've worked on it for a year, I wanted you to know about this, and say, you can back it, and that would be amazing, and thank you. You can tell other people about it. You can just send me a thank you note, and all of those are great ways to participate in what you've made. Again, a reminder that everybody in this room is developing like a very wonderful skill set of being able to design, make, and ship things. Most people in the world can't do that. And most people in the world now have apartments and homes full of things that they've bought that they don't know anything about how those things got made. If you make something meaningful and you give people the opportunity to understand how it happened, you're giving them meaning again. You're giving the object in their life meaning again. And that's a good thing to do. It's not something that like any of us should take lightly, which means that the fourth or fifth time you do it, if it's just like a slight iteration of what you did the first time, and you're presenting it as like a whole new other big thing, then yeah, there's something there that like you're gonna feel a little bit like ooh, should I really be doing this? And as long as you're being honest with yourself and you're taking feedback from people that are close to you that will speak to you honestly, you'll be fine. Even the fact that you're asking this question means that like you're thinking about this stuff from a good place.
Hi, me again. One, I would like to say that your analogies are really great. They're very illustrative. I appreciate that. Before you were talking about like the standards and commitments that Kickstarter has publicly announced, and I was wondering if there's like a set of standards for the kinds of projects that people are posting up to the platform, and if you moderate them, do you ever take things down if they don't meet those standards?
That's a great question. So I interpret this question as, do you have guidelines and rules around the projects that you have on your site? And we do. We have three sets of guidelines. First, this has to be something that fits in our categories and can be shared with other people. So you can't necessarily run a project that says, I want to buy some real estate. This happens, right? So it has to fit into one of our categories, and fundamentally it has to be something that can be shared with other people. We have a set of rules that say you cannot run a project for drugs or drug paraphernalia. You cannot run a project for firearms. So there's definitely like a list of like, you cannot run projects for these things. And we have a review process for all these things, especially in the design and tech categories. Everything gets reviewed by a human being that is looking to make sure that it fits into our core guidelines, but also for tech and design, and this is critical for you guys, making sure that there's a visible prototype that showcases the functionality of what you're presenting in a way that backers will understand it as well. And speaking to your comment earlier, we don't allow photorealistic renderings. And that is mainly there to make sure that there's a very direct and clear representation of what you've accomplished to backers. We do allow for things like CAD drawings, and I think that those are really good in illustrating process and illustrating development of a product, but not the photorealistic stuff. It does. It's a pretty common topic of discussion. So intellectual property on Kickstarter, we don't police that unless it's a DMCA claim, which is just like the general law. Like if there's a trademark infringement on our site, there's an official place where somebody can submit a claim that says this project is infringing on my trademark. That's one thing. In terms of intellectual property like patents, it's the internet, it's public. If you put your stuff out there and it's successful, generally speaking, there will be other teams that see this that might get inspired, and you might think they might have gotten a little too inspired. It's nothing that we get directly involved in. But my advice to creators that are thinking about this is, if you focus on community, if you focus on storytelling, if you focus on the thing that you're doing and you build a community around it, then people will want to continue to support you and engage with what you've created, as opposed to somebody that's done something very similar. The Fire and Bone guys had somebody who created a project that was basically the same as theirs, that launched like a couple of months after theirs. And you know, they expressed some frustration to me, and they expressed like a sense of like, why is this happening, and can you stop it? I said, I can't. How could I tell someone you can't run this project? How can I tell someone you were too inspired by the other one to the point where it's basically a copycat? It's not fair for me to get involved at that level. What I did tell them was stop worrying about this and focus on your community and your customers and your product. Make it better. Make sure that like it shines the next time you run a project. And on a more kind of like tactical and pragmatic level, if you're a small team in a small company, focusing on things like patent law is very difficult. Patents are something that you don't just receive, you also have to spend time and money later on to protect. So it's a really weird trade-off. I don't want to ever say like, there's no reason to ever get a patent on what you're doing. You do a lot of good work. You should be able to protect it. You should be able to engage in a marketplace in which like you feel protected by the rules. But also, if you're able to just kind of be agile and move very quickly, you're probably on the next thing by the time somebody else is kind of looking at your product and saying, I'm going to copy that. The team that has done a great job with kind of staying ahead of this is a team called Studio Neat.
They've been here a couple of years.
Cool.
And this is their message. It's not how they want to spend their time.
No.
And they're very ripped off all the time.
Oh, totally. They don't care. They just, it's a two-person studio. They do their own thing. They outsource everything that they don't want to engage in. And they just remain as focused as possible on designing the next thing and launching it. They've run either 4 or 5 campaigns with us so far. They're obsessed with like cocktail paraphernalia right now. Anything else?
I'll hit you one more time here too. You had mentioned, and I think I wasn't sure if I heard you right. Was it like a 90% rate of people who didn't fulfill when you did? 9%. Okay, cool. Well, I got to admit I was in that 9%. Not that I didn't fulfill, but I did it way late. And it's actually been a struggle for me in terms of, just because of process things that I had, it's like knowns and unknowns and all that. But you guys had reformatted not too long ago where sort of the project page is like lives in perpetuity, like it never goes away, and it's kind of tied directly to who you are as a creator. And because like I felt like I had sort of failed my backers in the way that I did, I've kind of been struggling with whether that's going to weigh heavily on me as a creator and as somebody who can fulfill. And I know that there's some way to sort of mitigate that with some community response to say, hey, I learned a lot and I promise like this time it's going to be way different. But do you have like any like maybe more hard suggestions on like ways to do that besides just kind of like being really direct and honest? Is there some things like, I mean, I've even like gone to the point of thinking, I know this sounds a little ridiculous, but even like maybe creating a new profile for something else. And I know that is very dishonest, but just wondering if you had some feedback there. And
Well, I mean, let's contextualize this. How many backers did you have?
like 250.
How late were you?
Like 4 or 5 months.
You're fine.
Yeah.
You're fine. 4 or 5 months. How many people actually complained?
About a dozen. I mean, on the actual site, the emails that I got were pretty intense, but gotta admit.
I do have a very specific, like, hard piece of advice, which is that the internet sometimes as a medium for conversation can be tough.
Yeah.
Get on the phone with them.
Yeah.
It's something that people want to avoid, but like that's like the harder version of this to deal with it is to say like, hi, like, this is my number. You don't have to give me your cell phone number. You can give me Google Voice number.
Yeah.
Call me. Let's talk about this.
Cool.
You spend 15 minutes on the phone with somebody. Now both sides know that there is a human doing this. And there's a lot more empathy and understanding that comes from that. But also, when I say that you're fine, what I mean is that like you're taking this very seriously. And a lot of like what goes into mitigating this is communicating and over communicating and saying, I did this is what I learned from it, this is how the next one is going to go, and send them the preview. Send those 250 people the preview of your next project and be like, this is what my next project looks like. What do you think? Yeah. Involve them in the process. It's a lot harder to criticize if you've been a part of the process of creating it.
I think that's a great suggestion. Thank you.
Cool. Anything else?
And we'll let maybe people talk to you individually. Thank you so
Yes.
much, John.
Thank you guys for having me.